My last grand rounds was 32 years ago. I think I was 10. 12. 32 years ago. So I was an intern here in 1985. And it's been a long journey, but it truly is a privilege to be back. And I want to welcome you all to talk about the Bone and Joint Institute. And I also want to thank you for all those people, all the familiar faces that have welcomed me. It's been a really inspiring and great feeling. And I appreciate that. So I'm going to give you a 30,000-foot view of healthcare at the Bone and Joint Institute, but we're going to get down to the weeds a little bit too. So those of you who don't know me are going to have to bite their lip and keep their eyes open when I talk about data. I'm going to talk a lot about data. So be patient with that. And then we're going to break it down this way. It's going to start out a little unconventionally. We're going to have 3 brief history lessons. Then I'm going to talk about welcoming you to a new era in healthcare. And then the biggest part of the talk is my wildly important goals. Wildly important goals for the Bone and Joint Institute. What it means to be an institute, and I can't talk about what it means to be an institute unless we talk a little bit about where we are in healthcare today. And then along the way, we're going to talk about action plans that are already in place to achieve our goals, okay? So history lesson number 1. And question number one for a t-shirt. Who developed the heliocentric theory? The heliocentric theory was
Galileo.
Who said Copernicus? Shepherd. So in the 1500s, everyone was convinced. In fact, you were heretic if you didn't say that the Earth was the center of the universe, And it was Nicholas Copernicus who said, actually, the sun. He died a year later, and it wasn't until Galileo developed a telescope that could magnify 20 times. Whoa. That was a big deal back then, 20 times. And he invented a telescope. And how did Galileo, second question, how did Galileo figure out that actually the sun was the center of the solar system? Anybody know? Anybody? Bueller? Anybody? He looked at the revolving moons of Jupiter and the pattern of Venus and confirmed that the Earth actually revolved around the sun. And he got blamed for it. It was heresy. He was imprisoned. He died in his home, right? Was unable to leave. And his argument was that the discussion of natural problems ought to begin not with scriptures, but with experiments and demonstrations. And technical difficulty. The Bible tells you how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. Famous quote. And so I want you to remember this about this history lesson. Measure what is measurable and make measurable what is not so. We're going to get back to that. So that's history lesson number 1. History lesson number 2 is what happened to Hartford Hospital in 2007. Next question. When was Hartford Hospital founded?
1864.
Who said 1854? I can't give you a t-shirt. Did somebody else say 1854? So in 2007, we tried to get a joint replacement institute going at Hartford Hospital, and we were blocked by the administration. We didn't ask for any more money. We wanted an efficient system that developed quality care. And so 4 orthopedic surgeons left in 2007. It was called dramatically, sorry, this clicker's not working. It's going to drive me nuts because I like to walk when I talk. But it was called the Exodus. Oh, big dramatic thing, the Exodus. But believe it or not, it was the catalyst for changing the administration. The administration either left or were fired, and a whole new administration came in. That's when Elliot Joseph came. That's when Jeff Flax came. And we built across town, at a small hospital across town, the Connecticut Joint Replacement Institute. And what I learned there was that you could actually collaborate with people who were your competitors in a different system and use data to transform your behavior, make data-driven decisions, and really develop quality care. And you recognize some of these Jim Oaks up here. Right there's me on the right, Dr. Zimmerman on the left. And Dr. Zimmerman did the first total knee replacement at CJRI on July 31st, 2007. Remember that, Gordon?
Vaguely.
Vaguely. And that place has done exceptionally well. It's ranked one of the top 10 joint replacement institutes in the country now. We knew at that time that Hartford Healthcare would have a response, want to also develop a musculoskeletal institute. So this was the footprint back in 2007, and here we are today. So we wouldn't be here in this room unless we'd thought about how to make processes of care better and how to use data to help improve the patient experience. And, in some ways, have the guts to make those decisions. So here's the ribbon cutting ceremony in November 2016. Dr. Zimmerman in the front, Dr. Lewis. And is Cortland here?
Right here.
So, a bow to Dr. Cortland Lewis, who I will call the father of BJI, who really set the processes of care in place to make this place a great institution. Round of applause for Dr. Lewis. So history lesson number 3, this is a little out there now. History lesson number 3 is that healthcare is paradigmatic. That we go through eras of how we look at healthcare, how we look at routines, how we look at processes of care. The first era, this is Don Berwick's work from Institute of Medicine, or Institute of Healthcare Improvement, former CEO. The era of Hippocrates. The era of Hippocrates is medicine is a beneficent and noble profession. Doctors have special knowledge. You go to the doctor because he or she is knowledgeable, and medical professionals will self-regulate. We will regulate ourselves to make ourselves better. Well, guess what? Over time, that didn't work out so well. A lot of variability in care, high morbidity and mortality. Doctors sometimes don't know everything. And so a different era came, and that's the era of external accountability, of being measured, of looking at incentives, looking at markets, and being rewarded or punished for how you do. And I would pose that Don Berwick is right, that we're entering a new era of medicine. And it's not an era that you haven't heard about, but it's about patient-centered care. Now, that word is already getting a little watered down, right? So we have to be cautious about that. But what I mean about patient-centered care is that now we measure, analyze, and apply metrics that matter to patients. Not as much mattering to doctors, physicians, and all the healthcare workers in this room, but what matters most to the patients that we take care of. And so how do we define patient-centered care? So if you think about the solar system, in healthcare, we have a fragmented, non-integrated system where patients have a hard time in a fee-for-service model getting integrated care across the continuum of their disease and have a sense of their own well-being. I would pose that the Copernican revolution we need, the Galilean revolution that we need, is putting the patient at the center of our universe. Not us, not the healthcare system, not the hospital, but the patient. So we need to strive beyond what we ordinarily see, right? We need a different kind of lens, we need a different kind of telescope to focus on what matters to patients. So the Institute of Medicine defines patient-centered care as providing care that is respectful of and responsive to individual patient preferences, needs, and values, and ensuring that patient values guide all clinical decisions. That's a pretty dramatic statement, right? So what patient cares to me is this. It's not about asking, what is the matter with you? It's more about asking, what matters to you? So in that spirit, I have taken the liberty, apologies to Dr. Lewis, of rewriting the mission statement. And there's a copy of this up in the front. You can take it with you. And I'll read it, and the rest of the talk is going to kind of talk about these issues. The Bone and Joint Institute is a multidisciplinary group of providers united by the common goal to deliver safe, efficient, world-class, comprehensive musculoskeletal care in Connecticut, nationally and internationally. Our collaborative team uses data-driven decisions to continually enhance patient-focused care that is supported by critical thinking, research, education, and innovation in order to continuously promote and improve the musculoskeletal health and well-being of every patient. That's a long mission statement, right? It should be shorter. Couldn't make it shorter. So let's talk about that. And now we're going to move to the wildly important goals, right? The wildly important things. And these are them. So patient-centered care is the top, and what we need to create an environment for patient-centered care are these following things: data analytics, research, education, innovation, and then we have to know what the cost of care is. So let's start with data analytics. And the bottom line, if you fall asleep in this part, is that I want and we need to have data be our common language. So what does that mean? Well, big data, that's another big buzz term now. Big data, we're in the era of big data. Well, if you think about big data, and you look at all the successful companies in the world now, the most successful companies, think about them. Airbnb is the largest hotelier in the world and has no hotels. Uber is more successful financially than GM or Ford. They have no automobile. Netflix, the biggest movie seller in the world, has no movie theaters. Right? Amazon knows that when I click on Amazon, they're going to send me a backpack because I like to hike. And Google, we know about Google, right? So all of these companies use data about their customers to improve the customer experience and ready accessibility, right? Well, who does that in healthcare? Who does it in healthcare? Who is in charge of big data about outcomes that matter most to patients? Well, all we really have is a conglomerate of companies, insurance industries, external reviewers who use CMS data to make decisions about how we're doing, right? And I would pose to you that the CMS database is not accurate. So if you look at how CMS uses data, it's all about ICD-10 codes. And the ICD system was meant to be an epidemiologic system for disease entities. It was never meant to be a system for billing. Never meant to be a system for billing. And so if you use data for reimbursement purposes, that's a bad way to look at how we analyze taking care of patients. Multiple examples of this. This is the most dramatic one. I love this one. You guys heard of Pearl Diver? Big data analytic company. So they use CMS database. They use data from insurance companies that's public. 4 billion patient records from CMS and private insurance companies. So the zombie study was that in that database, they looked up death in a hospital, about 2 million patients. And they found that 1 out of 400 of them then had a subsequent procedure, right? So either we're operating on dead people, or 1 out of 400 times, the database is wrong. Had to have a zombie study a week before Halloween, right? Another example, a local well-known Connecticut surgeon was labeled by the ProPublica data system, which is supposed to protect patients, as a dangerous total hip arthroplasty surgeon. 1 day later, right? Checkbook said he's a 5-star, top-rated total hip arthroplasty surgeon. Same database. So from the same CMS claims data, we're getting different answers. So who's right? Where's the truth? I would also suggest to you that quality is often measured by imposed metrics that may not have a relationship to how actually patients do. The classic one is length of stay in the hospital, right? We're driving length of stay down. You're a bad doctor unless you get your hip replacement arthroplasty patient out the next day, right? Well, there may be some patients who are actually safer, better, and have a better patient experience if they're there for 3 days. We just got to figure out who that is. But CMS doesn't know that. All CMS knows is whether they're out on day 1 or day 5. So many quality metrics, not just length of stay, may not measure quality outcomes. So what does that all mean? That means that if we don't collect meaningful data of our own, someone else is going to measure it for us, right? So it's incumbent upon us as an institute to start collecting our own data, make sure it's adjudicated and real, benchmark it with other institutions, always listen to CMS, but make sure that we're actually dealing with data that's true to the patient. So top priority at the BJI is to adjudicate the codes, to make sure that when a patient comes into the hospital through Epic, that their codes are adjudicated, that they're real. When they're discharged, their codes are accurate. Otherwise, we don't have any data to look at because we can't rely on CMS. That's vitally important. So here's my patient from this week. All right? So on the discharge summary, I added two things that Medicare wants to see and that are true. One is the patient had atrial fibrillation, so they have a hypercoagulable state. If I don't use those words in the discharge summary, and I discharge the patient more than 2 days after the operation, CMS thinks I'm a bad doctor. The patient is mildly anemic. We could argue whether they should have even had a blood test. But if I don't, unless I say mild acute blood loss anemia, then the code is not correct, and the hospital may not get reimbursed for part of the hospital stay. So that's not gaming the system. That's about accuracy, but it's also about making sure that the codes are correct. And so the billing is correct, so that the hospital has the correct revenue, and so that the patient has an experience that we can reflect upon and understand the data. So here's the action plan. We need a dedicated Epic team, and we're going to get one. We need health information coders in our geographical space, and we're going to get them. All right? So we're going to start out adjudicating Epic data, and that's paramount importance right off the bat. Oh, thanks. Do you still need that thing? Thank you. Wow, awesome. Good. We're good. So, if you think about data in healthcare, I want to talk about registries, because registries are really important. So what registries are a systematic collection of data, patient demographics, procedures, devices, implants, what happens, adverse events, on a well-defined cohort of patients, joint replacement patients, ankle fracture patients, spine patients, for instance. And we have a great registry now that Dr. Lewis set up, Mike Cremens, and now that Sherry Stoller runs. That's the Registry of Orthopedic Spine and Trauma Reconstruction, roster. This is a manual entry database. It's in an access file, and it has important stuff. It's got all the adverse events. We call every single patient, so we know this is real data. We know it's true. What it doesn't do is have a relational database atmosphere to it through which we can benchmark other places. So when I'm talking about a relational database, a true registry will have not only information from Epic, but ASAPs, perhaps CMH, Force TGRF, and because remember the Force program, roster, Quantros, Quest Diagnostics. These are just examples. Cost of care, patient-reported outcomes. Right? So that massive relational database then can get tapped into, and on many levels, we can ask queries about what was the cost of care, what was the length of stay, what were the adverse events, did the patient have blue eyes, were they right-handed, how tall were they? Ask a question, did they have brown hair? I mean, being dramatic, obviously. But specific things that we can compare cohorts of patients and then make decisions about how they actually did. So the value of a registry is that it brings us to evidence-based decision-making and enables precise performance measurements, way more than CMS can, way more than any insurance company can. I love this quote. Science tells us what we can do. Guidelines what we should do. I'm already losing my voice, sorry. Registry is what we're actually doing, And so all data inputs will go into a data analytic adjudication system. Notice that the follow-up phone calls are of paramount importance. We actually have to have real contact with the patient, what actually happened to them. And that would go into the BJI registry. We've got to call it something other than the BJI registry. Roster will always be there. Right? Roster will be part of it. We need to think of a good acronym. I love acronyms. We have to think of an acronym that's going to make this work so we can all remember it. And spine may have their own registry. Joint replacement may have their own registry. Trauma may have their own registry. There'll be all one big registry together. I have to talk about PROs. PROs are here to stay. They're well-intentioned. They're validated surveys that can tell us more than I can tell myself about how the patient actually did. Now, there are all sorts of flaws in that system, right? If you really want to know how a patient did, you have to ask them 100 questions. I'm not going to read them. They're not going to answer them. So validated surveys are a small group of questions that seem to be related to how patients do. The International Association Consortium for Health Outcomes, the tongue twister, ICHOM, right, is doing this across all sorts of disease entities: depression, anxiety, cleft palate, lumbar spine disease, osteoarthritis of the hip and knee. So there's a standard set of questions that can be used internationally. And so if patients get their questions before their surgery and after their surgery, you can at least measure some validated patient-centered test that tells them how you're doing. So we're probably familiar with the COOS and the HOOS for osteoarthritis, the hip and knee, ODI for the spine, and there are multiple other patient-reported outcomes measures, right? Where they fail, all right, is that the patient who comes into my office doesn't really give a damn what their COOS score is, right, with their bad knee. They just want to get better. I can tell that if they come in with a COOS score of 40 on a scale of 100, that they're in a lot of pain, and if their exam and their x-ray correlates with the COOS score, that they may need or may benefit from a joint replacement. What it doesn't tell us is what is their goal? What do they want for the well-being of their life, right? It doesn't tell us whether they want to walk from their house to the grocery store or they want to get in a kayak. So there's some limitations to patient-reported outcomes, and I would suggest that we need other surveys that we might be able to develop, and it's not a trivial task to have a validated survey, that talks more about patient well-being. And so all the individual needs of the individual patients can be summed up in PROs, but we need to go beyond that. There are a lot of deficiencies. What are their goals for recovery is what we need to be asking. Now, in a crowd, human beings may look sort of the same. You guys look pretty bland to me right now, actually. Not really. But as similar as we all have different personalities, different characteristics, and different needs. And that's what patient-centered care is about, is personalizing needs to what your intervention is going to be, whether it's surgical or non-surgical. And here's the oxymoron. Here's the dichotomy. In order to do that, we need to standardize care. Which means that doctors and clinicians, all of us as healthcare providers, need to do processes that are similar. Now, I know that's antithetical to most of your guts. Because when I do it, this is how I do a joint replacement, and I do it this way because I do it this way, because I've been doing it for 30 years, and because I think that's the best. It's better if I decide with my colleagues that we are going to do processes of care in a similar way. I'm going to still do the same surgery I do, but the antibiotics, the TXA, the follow-up, the physical therapy can be standardized. If it's not standardized, then we're measuring all sorts of variability. If we measure variability from a data set, we can't make data-driven decisions about what we actually did. So we need to argue about standardization. This is my favorite slide of the whole talk. Because this is what doctors do, right? When they say, we're going to do it in a similar way, right? And so you got to get in a room, and you got to piss and moan, and you got to argue, and it helps you dig deep about why you're doing it the way you're doing it. And if we have actual data about outcomes, well, maybe John Grady Benson is given too many antibiotics. Maybe I don't need to do that. Maybe I'm not getting my patients up quick enough. Maybe I'm not getting them out of the hospital soon enough, right? Because other people might be doing it better than I am. So when surgeons, doctors, healthcare providers, physical therapists, all of us in the room, all right, when we make decisions only based on our opinion, I call that eminence-based data, right? I'm doing this way because I'm doing it this way. Don't talk to me about it. This is the way it needs to be done. Now, our experience is super important, right? I'm not belittling that. I'm not belittling the 30 years of experience I have. I have an intuitive feel for certain things that I trust and that I know. That's important. That's really important. But what's more important is talking about it and standardizing care so we can get to evidence-based medicine, right? And where evidence-based medicine is, where the rubber meets the road there, is that's when we can make a difference about what is credible and how it can affect our patients. You guys know Edward Deming, the statistician? All the analysts are shaking, are nodding. Without data, you're just another person with opinion. Opinions are important, but data will drive the decision. So our moral obligation is to ask every day, how often are we right, and what data do we have today to support decisions today about patient care? So let's talk about that. So the data's got to be clean, it's got to be credible, and then it has to be actionable. So how are we going to make data actionable? The first actionable thing we do is we make it transparent, right? Which means that John Grady Benson's data is not going to be hidden somewhere. My data is going to be up against all the other patients that all the other doctors that I'm working with. And then you have to be able to handle the truth. So you have to have guts. You have to have Galileo guts, right? I hope nobody gets locked up in a room and dies in their house. But you have to have guts. And the guts are that this type of stuff, dashboards of what actually happens to patients, infections, outcomes, and including financial data, by the way, including financial data, how much cost did I incur on the system to get the outcome that I wanted, the outcome the patient wanted. And I won't go through all these things, but these are patient-reported outcomes on the bottom. You can see what the patient-reported outcomes are compared to national standards. And then we can see what our own standards are and benchmark it against everybody else. And so you have to be transparent about it. We have to have a list of our names right there. And we're already doing that here. We're already doing that here. So we've got guts. There are guts in the room. I feel it. I won't get, so here's where it gets a little bit too much in the weeds. I'm not going to get too far into this. Don't worry. Don't worry. The cumulative sum analysis is a statistical process control thing. And it's about trying to determine whether a blip in the curve is real or not real. Think of it as BMWs putting tires on cars at a factory. Right? By a statistical process control method, BMW decides, I'll make this up, 1 out of every 10,000 cars has a wheel that's slightly off. And no matter what the hell they do, they still get 1 tire out of 10,000 cars that's off. It's just not quite right. They always want to make it 0, just like we want to make our infections 0. But every month, every now and then, they're going to have 2 cars that come up in a month that have 2 wheels off. Do you get alerted about the 2 cars that month? Not necessarily if the cumulative mean is actually the same. So if you have two wheels that are off in a month, maybe you have 2 years where the tires are all okay. So if you set alert values, then you know based on the variations whether it's part of the mean, part of the whole, or whether you have to get upset about it. So we're going to try to use funnel plots in this regard. So if you look at your performance versus other surgeons, you want to be 2 standard deviations below the mean, right? And if you're one of these red dots, we got a problem. But then the goal is not to shame the person who's the red dot. The goal is try to get everybody down towards the mean and working together to do that. So if you look at statistics, everything's a bell-shaped curve. So if we... Megan's already laughing. So if we looked at the bell-shaped curve of how many people are laughing right now, right? Megan would be a top performer, right? And the people who are asleep would be a bottom performer, right? If we shame the bottom performers, if I call you out because you're sleeping, all right, I would, yeah. So we don't want to be Bart Simpson. We want to be Michael Jordan, right? Think about running or basketball. Statistically, what that means, the tendency in medicine is to shame the bottom performer. You did a bad job. And the top performers are saying, I'm great, I'm just freaking awesome. If you think about shaming the bottom performers statistically, all that does to the mean is just a little lean. If you think about all of us working together and the top performers helping the bottom performers, meaning that we are all responsible for the data that we generate from the same institute, then the mean will move farther to the right. The mean will move farther to the right. Think about the Golden State Warriors. Now, I'm not a basketball freak, right? Except for last year, right? But the Golden State Warriors have great players, right? But why did they win championships year after year? Because they had the highest number of assists compared to any other basketball team. It was all about a team sport. And it was all about not blaming and shaming the low performers, the people who didn't do a great job. It's about building a team that can work together, right? And that's what we need to think about when we're talking about data-driven decisions, building a team that works together. So it's time for a Galilean revolution. We all need to make data-driven decisions, and data, I believe, will become our common language when we talk about what we do at this institute. So the action plan is we need to support that. So we are already going to recruit for clinical informatics analysts who will help Nishalatoa, database developers who can analyze data, and I'll get to statisticians in a minute. Now, here's another thing. We don't have to do this But this is the way I think of it. When I was in Morbidity and Mortality Conference 32 years ago, and one of my cases came up, I was in the back row like the PAs over here. And if my case was called out, I'd be thinking, "Oh, damn. I made an error. I made a mistake." And that's not acceptable in medicine, right? We're taught that we need to be perfect. We're taught that we can't make mistakes. And indeed, we don't want to, right? We don't want to make mistakes because it can affect patient care. But if you blame it and you shame it, you'll never get better. And the Morbidity and Mortality Conference is embedded in kind of that punitive attitude, in my opinion. So I would suggest that we actually don't call it Morbidity and Mortality anymore, that we actually call it Healthcare Value Advisory Conference, that we actually talk about what matters to patients, what the cost of the care is, and how we can transform the better experience. So I'd like to do that. We don't have to do that. It's up to the residents, because they're going to have the conference, right? We still need to talk about complications. So today was going to be what, Trauma Complications Day? Or M&M Day? Next week. So next week's M&M. I mean, what cases do you pick? It's really hard, right? Each service line needs to go through every single case. But I would say as a conference, as a team, we can talk about all sorts of things that might impact healthcare value and the patient experience. Tweak it a little bit. Just a thought. I think we should do it. We don't have to. All right, let's move on to research now. And research is an obvious segue from data analytics. And is of paramount importance to this place. Because if all we want to do is do a high volume of cases and be non-inferior, that's fine. There are places that need to do that. If we want to be an institute, we have to do research. And this is why. The data analysis and the clinical care guidelines are linked. They are linked together. And so let's talk a little bit about process improvement. Plan, do, study, act. All right? And I'm going to give a common example that's almost every institution now in the last 10 years or so. And that's about blood transfusions after joint replacement. So it's an example that everybody can identify with. So in about 2010, the transfusion rate across town was 21% for joint replacement. Way too high. The FOCUS study came out, and I think Dr. Lewis is involved in the FOCUS study here, yeah? Which said that based on the FOCUS trial, you actually didn't have to transfuse people. It might be actually dangerous. You may be actually increasing infection rates if you give people blood for a hemoglobin of 9 just because they were weak that day. So a new protocol was implemented in 2011. Transfusion rates dropped to 4%. But it's plan, do, study, act again, right? You want to go from 4% to lower. So what happened in about 2011? TXA comes around. We know that TXA is safe. It stabilizes blood clots, doesn't cause them. So it's safe to give after surgery. And what happens? New protocol in 2014, the transfusion rate is down to 1%. Plan, do, study, act again. Now we are looking at topical TXA versus IV TXA, and you can just do the whole thing over again, right? So all those questions about transfusions and the patient experience are about how do we improve patient safety, how do we make the patient experience better. So you have a clinical idea, you test it, you analyze it, you implement it, and then you have an opportunity to evaluate it. It becomes research when we write about it and improve the general knowledge of the public and improve our own general knowledge for our own education. So if you look at abstracts on a yearly basis here. Biomed, 5,000 publications a day. On Medline, about 1,500 per day. If you look at randomized controlled trials, the top of the pyramid for research integrity, about 95 a day. How many are orthopedic? About 1. If you look at the RCTs in orthopedics, how many patients are in them? 150, 200. It's hard work. It's hard work. We read a lot about what these studies show. It often doesn't change our practice, right? It often doesn't change our practice. However, if we get involved in this process, we start to think critically about what the patient experience is. And by the way, a lot of it is bias and confounding, right? So I'm getting paid by a company to do a study. I have a bias about what the outcome is going to be. So a lot of research now, I think, is going to shift from randomized controlled trials, which are still very important, to processes of care. and I'm sorry the video, I wish I had a video of this. Gordon would love the video of this. But so think about processes of care. Think of what happens when race car drivers change their tires at a pit stop. These guys do it in, what was it, a second and a half?
2.5.
2.5 seconds, yeah, right. It's crazy, right? Now, we would say they're moving fast, right? They would say, I know exactly what my job is, and I'm being very efficient. I know exactly what my job is, and I'm being very efficient. There's a lot of research that can be done on an operational basis that we can be involved in that will improve the efficiencies of care and the process of care. In addition to asking questions about medicines and comparing this to that. So our action plan for research is we will recruit for a nationally recognized research person. We are extremely privileged and lucky to have Carl Nissen continue to be our medical advisor for research, and he will is tasked to direct the research team. And so we're already going to have a research engine starting. We're going to have statisticians. We're going to have a research committee that's going to adjudicate what projects we should be doing. And we have a lot of funding and backing from the hospital. This is going to happen. It's going to become part of who we are. It has to become part of who we are. So, hang on a second. Uh-oh. I am no longer genuine. There we go. Okay. So, if you think about research, you can't talk about research without education, right? Patient-centered care is a systematic investigation of clinical problems to develop, test, and evaluate the patient experience and to contribute to the generalizable knowledge about what we're doing, right? This place has a history of teaching for how long? More than 160 years. More than 160 years. And we need to continue that tradition, not just because it's a tradition, because it's what we need to do. So there is a commitment by the hospital, by the University of Connecticut, by me, by I hope a lot of us in this room, to continue to teach fellows, residents, and medical students, and ourselves. And ourselves. The things I've learned the most about in medicine have been when I am teaching about it. And I'll get a question that I think, saying, I know a lot of this stuff. And I'll get a question out of the blue, like, what? Never thought of it that way. We need young minds to help old brains, right? Young minds can help old brains. So I call education really more about creative collisions, right? And it's about collaborating with other disciplines. I sat in the room today with the other service line chiefs, somebody from medicine, somebody from urology, somebody from child care. And I know in that room that there are ideas in their disciplines that can have an effect on what I'm doing. And I know that I have ideas that can affect what they're doing. So it's about colliding, not in this way, not in this way, but in this way. Creating more power from energy coming together and asking different questions in different ways. So we need to be open-minded about that. Because things are going to change. Change is our only constant, all right? What I did 10 years ago, I'm not doing stuff anymore. 10 years from now, I doubt that there's going to be a doctor doing a joint replacement without a robot. All right, that's at a tipping point. 15% of the places in the country now are using robotic surgery for joint replacement. And it is indeed more accurate. Is it worth the cost? Does it really change the outcome? We have to test that, right? But I didn't walk here today, drove here today. I didn't take a horse to Chicago 2 weeks ago. I flew. Robots are probably here to stay. And then the principle about education is leaving it better than you found it. All right, next question. Who said, there he is, right? Who said it? Who is that? And Mike Cremens, you can't answer this question. Does anyone know who Powell is?
He invented the Boy Scouts. I've already got one.
Back row PAs again. All right. That's right. Invented the Boy Scouts, worldwide Boy Scouts. Leave it better than you found it. All right? I'm not going to be here forever. we need to have young people do a better job than I can do, right? And that's about sending messages out to the country, right? Medical students training here and going to San Diego and say, this is how they did it at Hartford Hospital. This is how they did it at the Bone and Joint Institute. And it's about branding that. Education is vitally important to our patient care. So here's our action plan. We have a commitment to the UConn Department of Orthopedics, including fellowships. We have money for fellowships. And we have a commitment to educating each other. Now, here's my next commitment. I'm not a Twitter guy, right? I'm not a Twitter guy. But on Twitter, I'm going to have a reading list that'll come out roughly every 2 weeks about healthcare stuff. Don't be surprised if you see an article from Harvard Business Journal. Don't be surprised if you see something from Health Affairs. And we'll have articles from physical therapy, from sports medicine, from ankle fractures, all right? So we're going to try to get a collaborative environment about sharing what is happening outside of us and talk about it. All right, innovation. Well, innovation is a good segue from education, right? What does innovation mean? Innovative thinking is about doing things differently than we're used to. Artificial intelligence is here to stay, right? AI is not science fiction. It is science. So an example of that, I can even show you on my phone. I've showed a couple of you this already. So I had a meeting last week with the head of operations and informatics at MIT, and he's got an app that he developed with Beth Israel that takes from their database all the demographics about length of stay in the hospital for sick patients, ICU specifically. So on the app, it says it predicts mortality or length of stay based on a series of questions. First question, I'd like my patients, I'd like to predict my patient's 30-day risk of mortality. Is the patient on a mechanical ventilator? Yes. Is the patient currently, what's the patient's age? I'm going to plug in 60. What is the patient's preoperative INR? Let's say they're coagulated. Let's say it's 3.1. What is the patient's preoperative serum bilirubin? Let's say it's 2, which is high, by the way. The final risk estimation for this patient to die is 71%. Now, they claim that this app, based on those numbers and questions, is 85 to 88% accurate. So every morning on rounds, the residents plug in on this app the data on their patient. Now, would I have come up with, in my small brain, to ask those specific questions and have an answer right now about what the risk of mortality is for that patient? No, none of us could. What does that? AI does that. Machine learning does that. So we are going to be able to beta test this here in the Bone and Joint Institute about orthopedic patients. Think about length of stay in the hospital. If you have an algorithmic system that can preoperatively predict how long a patient's going to be in the hospital after a joint replacement, think about how the patient flow changes. Think about how the attention to that patient changes. And there's numerous examples of how that can happen, right? Cool stuff. And data is now in the patient's hands, right? Not just on my phone, but on everybody's phone. And so we have to think about how we exchange health care not in a geographical space, but on the cloud. So it's not somebody calling me, waiting for my secretary to answer, getting told they can't see me for 3 months, waiting when they see me for another hour in a geographical space. It's going to be more about having information in their hands about what their disease entity is and how they can already start their treatment. So they just might go to CVS and get their x-ray and have a diagnosis, right? And then start a treatment plan before they come and see anybody. So here's our action plan. We're already talking to Force Therapeutics, which is a digital intervention company, digital care, in hand the joint replacement patients and other patients too. We're starting this real-time location system, which is a band on everybody's wrist. Right? Just that. Can everybody hear myself?
Yeah.
Yes.
So everybody gets a wristband. The patient's got a wristband. And we know exactly where they are in the hospital at all times. So think about it as a Google map of the patient. If you think about that, you can actually time how long they're in the operating room, how long they're in the PACU, how long it takes them to walk.
an affected patient, we know exactly where they are, so we can minimize contact with them. And then you can look at the cost of care, and you know exactly how much it costs to care for that patient across that continuum with all those little time episodes, right? And so workflow's better. Cool stuff. There's a butterfly handheld system. Sports guys know about this. You can plug into your phone, get an ultrasound of a knee on the field, know if your ACL is torn, so the patient gets immediate treatment. All integrated into the Hartford Healthcare system. And we've got the affiliation with MIT. All right, now, you guys with me? Everybody okay?
Yep.
Cost of care. I have to talk about cost of care. We're getting close, right? We're getting close. And if those of you have to leave. Medicine is a science, caring for people is an art. Healthcare is a business. We can't get around that. Healthcare is a business, right? And we tend to forget about this. We tend to forget about how much we're costing every day. And that's a problem. We know it's a problem because the U.S. has the most expensive healthcare system in the world. So for another T-shirt, who can tell me what the spend is, the per capita health expenditure in the United States? Notice that the bar is way above every other single country in the world, right? $10,500, right? $10,500. What do we get for that? Well, not a lot. Next question, and we'll keep it this time. What is the national health expenditure percentage of GDP in the United States?
20.
17.
19.
20. 18.
21.
Who said 18?
Thank
20 is, yeah. So we don't know exactly what it is because it takes several years to figure this out, right? But it's about last year, 2 years ago, 17.2%.
We have 17 up here.
You did have a 17? We got an extra T-shirt. Who did it?
Angela.
They're my duck.
Bad art. Look how much higher it is than any other country in the world. What do we get for that? All right, we don't get a lot for that. Because look at where our mortality rate is, how much we're spending compared to other countries. I'm going to move to Australia. And if you look at all metrics about safety, mortality, infant mortality, obesity, heart disease, cancers, look where we are compared to other countries at the bottom of the list. So, how much do we spend on health care in around 2017? One more T-shirt. How much is the healthcare spend per year in the United States? Everybody know?
1.5 trillion.
Other guesses?
3.5 billion.
Billion?
35.
Trillion? How many trillions?
3 trillion.
3 trillion.
You said 3 trillion. Chris. From Miami. It's a 3 trillion number. It's actually 3.8 trillion. That's trillion with a T. Right? That's $3,800 billion. Not a lot of bang for buck. So, healthcare reform about cost is happening. It's happening. We need to control our costs. I need to know how much the implant I'm putting in somebody's body costs. It's no longer appropriate for me to put in whatever the hell I want because I think that looks really good.
Homogeneous population.
And whatever happens in health reform, we need to know what our cost is, and we need to know what the outcome is related to the cost in order to make sure this place makes revenue and to make sure we're being responsible for our patients about the cost of care. Right? We can't have a business unless it makes money. It's a nonprofit hospital, right? But revenue is important. Now, if we place revenue above quality, I'd say that's a fail. Right? I actually think that if we are transparent about our prices and we still put quality above revenue and make hard decisions about that both quality and revenue will win. So we need to be cost conscious, but the goal is still patient-centered care, right? So if you look about quantity and quality, if we want to just do a lot of cases, we want to make a lot of money, That's great. There's some hospitals that do that. But if we want to put quality above revenue so that they both win, that's what institutes do. That's what institutes do. So, action plan is we need to know our drug and fixed costs. We need to know what each doctor needs to know, what the contribution margin is. All of us need to know what a Band-Aid costs. We're not going to use 20 of them. Oh, I dropped 20 of them on the floor. Big deal. So, this is a large mountain to climb, right? A lot from that. You could have grand rounds for weeks on each of those topics. But the future is what we talked about. The future is, I think, about patient-centered care. That's where our heart is. We need to use our brains to understand what all that means. And it's about data analytics, research, innovation, education, and cost of care. So, I don't like U.S. News and World Report. You know why? Because half it's BS. However, the hospitals are always named are truly big institutions that use data and have good patient experience. Cleveland Clinic, Hospital for Special Surgery, NYU. They're doing research, education, innovation, and trying at least to do patient-centered care. So our goal is not to get on the front page of U.S. News and World Report, but our goal is to use some of those same principles that get places there, right? So I don't think it's too bold to say, I do not think it's too bold to say that we can be like those places. I really don't think it's too bold to say. We've got all the tools here. We've got really great people here. We've got the systems that are here. We just got to keep moving it up. So the key to achieving that BJI vision is, again, a lot about data collection and adjudication and collaboration. And the culture is that data lines our patient care activities by patient-centered care. And evidence, I used to say evidence trumps opinion. Now I got to say evidence. So the next steps are developing a great team that works together, right? And it's all about collaboration. That's my experience, what I've learned. I think that's what most healthcare institutes do, collaborate. And here's, Carol gave me this slide yesterday about the BJI kingdom. So it said it right in my kingdom slide, right? So look at all this. We've got great systems of care. Now we just got to talk to each other. We have to ask the right questions. We have to make sure the patient's at the center of that. And every day we come to work, we say, how can I do a better job today? What question can I ask that's going to improve this patient's experience? And then we're going to talk about it. And if I make a mistake, because I'm a human being, I got to own up to it and talk about how we all make that better. So there are less mistakes. That's a delicate balance, right? It's not easy work. It's delicate balance. Sounds easy. Not easy. And so it gets back to Galileo, right? Measure what is measurable and make measurable what's not so. Having the guts to stick to your guns and saying, this is what I think the data tells us. And this is what might be. Let's talk about it. So there we are. From 30,000 feet down to right here. Cool place. Thank you very much for your attention. Questions?
I have 3 questions, each with 3.